October 25, 1944. Dawn breaks over the Sibuyan Sea. The water calm but tense, the horizon a thin red line behind the haze. Admiral Takeo Kurita, aboard his flagship Yamato, scans the communications logs with irritation. Reports of enemy carriers nearby, yet their flight patterns do not match the expected raids. Instead of sweeping attacks, odd blips crawl across the radar screens, low and deliberate. Officers murmur, unsure whether the instruments are miscalibrated or if something strange is in motion. Kurita's aide notes in the log that pilots fly as though they care nothing for their own return. The admiral says nothing, but his hand grips the chart table like a vice. A man trained to measure battle in formations and tonnage, now confronted by something that erases those equations. Engines rumble across the task force, the vibration like pistons grinding in a machine built too long without oil. A sound rises, thin at first, then building, the shriek of radial engines in a steep dive. Lookouts point skyward. Against the morning glare, one aircraft arcs down with uncanny precision, smoke trailing but no attempt to level off. Anti-aircraft gunners hesitate for a second too long because the dive looks less like combat maneuver and more like a fall. The plane does not break away. It keeps coming. Tracers hammer the sky, tearing fabric and fuel lines, but the Zero does not shift course. The first impact is a thunderclap, the detonation spitting flame and steel across the deck of a light carrier. Shock grips the crews. These were not bomb runs, not dogfights, but human-guided missiles. Flames lick upward, aviation fuel spilling down ladders, black smoke blotting the sky. The sea vibrates as explosions echo between ships. Sailors smell burning paint, cordite, and flesh, a stench that clings like grease to a gear wheel. For a moment, even the hardened gunnery chiefs freeze, registering that these planes are not breaking off, not circling for a second pass. They are one-way weapons. The reason for such a target becomes clear with brutal arithmetic. An American Essex-class carrier displaces over 34,000 tons and carries 90 aircraft, each with a range of nearly 1,500 miles when properly supported. One such ship requires a crew of more than 3,500 men, a floating airfield that can project power across the Pacific at a cruising speed of 33 knots. By late 1944, Task Force 38 alone fields 17 fleet and light carriers, a striking arm heavier than the entire Japanese Navy could now muster. Against this force, the Imperial Japanese Navy counts barely 400 operational aircraft across its surviving bases, many of them flown by pilots with fewer than 50 training hours. Fuel stocks shrink daily. The southern resource zone yields oil, but shipping losses choke delivery. Japan's carrier fleet is gone, its pilots dead, and its naval strategy reduced to arithmetic desperation. Every American carrier that sails unscathed multiplies pressure on the home islands. To sink just one is to claw back weeks of survival time. In steel terms, each carrier is a single gear tooth in the Allied machine, but one broken cog could jam an entire offensive operation. For the Japanese high command, the logic grows simple. A plane and a pilot are expendable. But the chance to ram 10,000 tons of enemy steel may be worth the cost. In Tokyo, staff officers shuffle papers through dim-lit rooms, the air thick with cigarette smoke and frustration. Code intercepts hint that the Americans expect major fleet movements, yet Japanese planners conceal a darker intent. For months, the naval staff has debated a last measure, a doctrine unlike anything in their textbooks. The plan receives euphemistic labels in memos, Tokubetsu Kogeki, special attack units. What these words disguise is the decision to weaponize despair. Oil shortages mean most training flights cannot even complete standard formations. Young men are sent aloft after 40 hours of cockpit time, compared to the 600 hours their predecessors once logged in 1942. Many can barely perform night landings, but that no longer matters, for they will never return from their next sortie. Engineers at Kyushu's scattered airfields weld steel plates hastily, carving bomb racks into the underbellies of Zeros and Hayabusas. Farmers' sons and university students barely out of adolescence walk past machine shops where workers smear grease on their hands like surgeons preparing for a brutal operation. What matters is not sortie endurance or kill-to-loss ratios, but collision probability. Japanese diaries note a shift in tone during this period. One pilot writes, "We are no longer measured by hours, but by the weight of the bomb under our wings." Takashiro Hattori, Daitoa Senso Kaizen Nishi, 1945. The aircraft themselves are stripped of every ounce of non-essential mass. The Mitsubishi A6M0, once famed for its agility, becomes a blunt instrument. Armor plating is removed. Ammunition belts are cut down to token bursts, enough for one strafing run at best. A single 250-kilogram bomb is bolted under the fuselage, a weapon capable of cracking open a carrier deck if delivered at a clean angle. With drop tanks attached, range stretches to over 100 miles, though the likelihood of navigating that distance with green pilots is slim. On paper, the Zero still boasts 340 miles per hour at level flight, but in practice, the overloaded machines handle sluggishly. In 1944 alone, Japanese factories produced nearly 9,500 Zeros, but many roll out already earmarked for kamikaze duty, their fates sealed at the moment of assembly. The cockpit becomes an execution chamber dressed as a fighter plane. Mechanics prime the engines, the smell of avgas strong, their faces expressionless as pilots sit inside and scribble farewell notes to families on rice paper. One engineer likens the work to tightening the bolts on a torpedo before release, a task precise but stripped of sentiment. On the airfields, propellers spin, churning dust, the vibration like steel pistons hammering against their own limits. The Americans first taste the reality of this new tactic on October 25, 1944. The escort carrier USS St. Lo, part of Taffy 3 off Leyte, braces under heavy skies. Radar pings show incoming raids, but they look routine until the flight paths flatten into direct, unwavering vectors. Gunners open fire, 20mm and 40mm tracers arcing upward in bright chains. 1-0 takes multiple hits, wings shredded, but it does not peel away. It drives straight into the deck. The impact detonates stored ordnance, ripping open the flight deck in an eruption of flame. Aviation fuel streams downward into compartments, feeding secondary explosions. Within less than an hour, St. Lo is ablaze beyond salvation, her crew leaping into oil-slick waters as the ship keels. Survivor George Pfeiffer later recalled, "The sea turned black with oil and fire, and the air was a wall of smoke." The shock spreads instantly through the task groups. This is not miscalculation, not pilot error, but a deliberate new form of attack. For the Japanese command, the weapon has drawn its first blood. For the American sailors staring at the inferno, the war has entered a phase they never imagined. A battlefield where the enemy's own death is the fuse. The American response is immediate and methodical, like gears locking into a higher rotation. Task Force 38's commanders issue new orders. Radar picket destroyers will form a perimeter, early warning sentinels whose crews know they are now deliberate targets. Combat air patrols, CAPs, expand, waves of F-6F Hellcats constantly circling overhead. Fighter direction officers learn to vector intercepts using Mark 1222 fire control radars, technology that can distinguish aircraft at 20 miles with increasing precision. Escorts tighten their formations, carriers nestling inside rings of cruisers and destroyers, each ship bristling with anti-aircraft batteries. In combat briefings, new language appears. Suiciders inbound. Doctrine shifts within days, a rare case of adaptation under fire. Every ship's radar plot now scans for low, straight lines, the telltale signature of a kamikaze run. Airwaves buzz with clipped commands, gunnery officers shouting corrections, fighter pilots diving like steel saw blades into enemy formations before they reach the fleet. The countermeasures are not elegant, but they are relentless, a machine building armor around its exposed gears. Yet the strain on men and material mounts beyond expectation. A kamikaze does not behave like a conventional bomber. It does not jink away under fire, does not retreat when damaged. Gun crews fire until barrels glow cherry red, 5-inch mounts recoiling so often that hydraulic seals burst. Ammunition expenditure rates skyrocket. Naval records show that by early 1945, it takes an average of 8,000 rounds of 20mm and 40mm fire to bring down a single incoming aircraft, U.S. Navy Bureau of Ordnance, Action Report, 1945. Inside turrets, the heat becomes suffocating. men passing out from cordite fumes and dehydration. Pilots, too, feel the crush. Hellcat squadrons fly up to 6 sorties in a single day, intercepting raid after raid, landing only long enough to refuel and rearm before being flung skyward again. Engines cough from overuse, spark plugs fouling, yet maintenance crews push them back into the fight. The tempo feels like pistons driven past their red line, every cycle threatening to shear. The human limit and the technical limit blur, both tested by an opponent who demands no escape route. The limits become brutally visible in the spring of 1945. April 6th marks the opening of Operation Kikusui Floating Chrysanthemum, a mass kamikaze offensive against the Okinawa invasion fleet. In one day, 355 kamikaze sorties roar out from Kyushu airfields, a wave so dense it blots the horizon. On May 11th, the fleet carrier USS Bunker Hill suffers the full measure of this tactic. 2 Zeros dive through her defenses, one slamming into the flight deck, the second moments later into the hangar deck. The explosions cascade through parked aircraft and fueled lines, igniting hundreds of gallons of avgas in seconds. The carrier burns like a furnace, her superstructure engulfed, ammunition cooking off in thunderous bursts. In less than an hour, 389 sailors are dead, another 264 wounded. The ship limps away but is effectively out of the war. Across the Okinawa campaign, the statistics accumulate with grim consistency. 4,900 American sailors killed by kamikaze strikes, accounting for nearly half of all U.S. Navy combat deaths in the final year of the Pacific War. Ships sink, men vanish beneath flames, and commanders realize this is not a weapon to be dismissed as desperation. It is calculated sacrifice with measurable results. Each strike may fail 9 times out of 10, but the 10th lands with catastrophic precision. For every American victory, the cost is paid in wrecked hulls and burned crews. The battlefield becomes less about territory gained and more about endurance against a weapon that ignores the boundaries of survival. Improvisation becomes the defining trait of survival. The U.S. Navy, already straining under kamikaze pressure, turns to science and engineering to claw back initiative. Radar-directed fighter control is refined until intercepts happen almost as fast as plots appear. Proximity fuses, a breakthrough of miniaturized electronics, arrive in vast numbers, allowing anti-aircraft shells to detonate within yards of a target rather than requiring a direct hit. Ammunition expenditure drops sharply where the fuses are used, making each shell a more lethal investment. Smoke screens, deployed from LVT amphibious vehicles around anchorages, spread haze over critical transports, disguising silhouettes from incoming pilots. Destroyers are retasked as radar pickets, stationed miles ahead of the fleet, knowing their role is sacrificial. The destroyer USS Laffey, struck by multiple kamikazes on April 16, 1945, somehow survives, blasted open, but kept afloat by crews working furiously below decks. On the Japanese side, improvisation carries a different face. Engineers produce the Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, a manned rocket-powered bomb. Strapped under a bomber until release, the Oka ignites a rocket motor that accelerates it past 500 miles per hour, too fast for interception. On April 12, 1945, one rams the USS Manert El Abele, detonating with such force that the destroyer splits in two and sinks within minutes. The battlefield transforms into an arms race between innovation and annihilation, each side welding steel and circuitry into the next desperate measure. The climax arrives over Okinawa, the largest kamikaze campaign of the war. Between April and June 1945, the Japanese launch 1,465 kamikaze sorties. The sea becomes a killing ground where ships vanish beneath fireballs, and the sky fills with spirals of smoke trails. At peak intensity, waves of 50, sometimes 100 aircraft dive in succession. American gunners fire until their ears bleed, decks coated with brass casings. Hellcat squadrons intercept dozens, but inevitably some break through. Destroyers are gutted, carriers left burning. The U.S. Navy loses 34 ships sunk and 368 damaged in the campaign, the greatest sustained naval punishment in its history. For the Japanese, the gamble consumes nearly 3,800 pilots, many barely out of training. Records show only about 19% of kamikazes struck their intended targets. United States Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The sheer weight of American industry, new carriers arriving monthly, replacement planes rolling off assembly lines in California and Michigan, absorbs the punishment. By June, the Kamikaze campaign has burned through over 400,000 tons of aviation fuel, resources Japan cannot replace. The gears of war grind down the last teeth of the Imperial Navy's machine. When the fires finally die down, the aftermath is measured in numbers that strip away myth. Kamikaze attacks sink 34 U.S. Navy vessels, damage 368 more, and kill nearly 5,000 sailors. Japanese pilots fly to their deaths in the thousands, a generation extinguished in deliberate sacrifice. Yet the strategic effect is temporary at best. America's carriers continue operations, bombardments intensify, and Okinawa falls. Japan's desperate gamble delivers shock, fear, and heavy casualties, but not victory. In Tokyo, surviving staff officers admit privately that the tactic could not alter the war's trajectory. The United States had outbuilt and outlasted them. The first time the Japanese Navy saw the Kamikaze, they froze, unable to process that a pilot's death could be wielded as a weapon. But history reveals the truth. A strategy built on sacrifice alone cannot outlast a machine powered by fuel, steel, and industry. In the end, the Kamikaze became not a turning point, but a final spasm of a war Japan had already lost.